Hello and welcome to the Safri Private Wealth Podcast. I'm Leonora Stevens, a private wealth partner based in Bristol. I'm joined by Mike Hodges, a fellow private wealth partner based in our Manchester office. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Leo.
Join us each episode for in-depth discussions on private wealth matters, from estate planning and trust to retirement and gifting strategies. We're here to provide practical tips to help grow and protect your wealth. Also, please don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Today, we will be discussing pensions and the impact of the changes announced in the budget in October 2024. I would like to firstly emphasise that we are not giving financial advice, so you should consult with your financial advisor. But what we want to cover is some of the practical considerations that we have been discussing with clients and sort of the tax implications of those changes that have been announced. So what's the issue? Well, before the budget, you could leave your pension on death to your next generation, with no IHT being due. So several clients would therefore let their pension pots build with the knowledge that there would be a large pot of funds going to the next generation free of inheritance tax. One of the benefits from a tax perspective, if you were to die before you reach the age of 75, then the beneficiaries could take that entire pot tax-free. Whereas if you die after the age of 75, then the beneficiaries would be taxed at their marginal rate on any payments out of the pension. Announced in the budget is that from April 2027, pensions will now fall into your chargeable estate for IHT purposes, therefore subject to 40% inheritance tax. So we don't have the legislation yet, but this change has concerned, understandably, several of our clients. Mike, what have you been discussing with clients, people who have built a large pension pot with the idea that that would be a large sort of nest egg to give to their children?
Yeah, it's a bit of a wait and see because, as you say, we haven't got the legislation, and where we're up to is consultation. If you click on the revenues page, it says we've got your responses. Thank you very much, because the consultation window has closed. So we're now waiting to see what comes out of it. I would say the consultation in terms is very, very narrow, technical. It's not talking about the principles we're going to discuss today. So it's a bit early to move. And I guess also we've got best part of 2 years. So not rushing into it, but taking the view that your pension is like any other asset for inheritance tax purposes, effectively. So it's not one that you could park to one side and ignore and say, well, that's tax favored, therefore I'll leave that and I'll spend money from elsewhere. That's now in the mix along with all your other assets and all your other wealth. So I guess that's just, well, it is a complete change, and it's an explicit change of policy from government saying that pensions should be for pensions and not for passing on wealth. Compare and contrast with the kind of cliche that always sits in my mind is the one that we had around wealth cascading down the generations, which I'm not sure whether I'm making that quote up or whether a chancellor said that or something similar. It may have been a George Osborne-ism, but it's a change. Got a couple of years to get used to it, but pension pot now in 99% of cases is an asset like any other asset that you hold.
Yeah, and I suppose pre the budget, we know that pensions always seem to be targeted, or people are always worried about there being a target. And I think the key worry people had was that they were going to take away the tax relief on paying into pensions. So I think there was probably a big flurry of people paying in, but it wasn't anticipated that we would then have this IHT charge that you can't. There isn't a huge amount that you can do. And I know that I've been talking to many of my clients about what to do with the pension, and I think one of the ideas is to take that 25% lump sum. As you said, we originally thought that pot was free of inheritance tax. So sort of leave that pot on its own and spend down your other chargeable assets, whereas now this is a chargeable asset. So do we start spending it? Do you take out that tax-free lump sum? Do you start making gifts to people now from that pot? And another one, an area where I have been talking in quite a lot of detail is, can people start taking an income from their pension, which is surplus to their requirements? And therefore, do we look at making surplus gifts out of surplus income into a trust, directly to children? And that's something I think is actually going to be quite a valuable benefit going forward if they can start taking an income. And just, unfortunately, it's not something that's going to solve the problem overnight. But if people start, if they're sort of in their mid to late 60s, then hopefully they should be able to chew into that over the next 20 years. It's where you've got the clients who are in their late 80s, where they might not necessarily have as much time to start going through the pot.
Yeah, and a couple of points on that, Leo. There's been some discussion. I'm not sure I've seen it formally written down anywhere. When you take your tax-free lump sum, is that income out of which you can make normal gifts out of income? And the consensus view, as we sit here in end of April 2025, seems to be yes, which is good news, because you could say, right, I can take that tax-free lump sum, not incur tax on it by definition, and use that to fund normal expenditure out of income. So that's some good news. The other point we haven't flagged at this point is, but it's a natural sort of flow from the fact this is just like any other asset for inheritance tax purposes, is it's subject to the spouse exemption. So if you have a situation where, you know, that your late 80-year-old taxpayer has a spouse, typically a wife who might have a longer life expectancy, spouse exemption will apply, again, as we understand the rules now. Therefore, pass to spouse, and spouse may have longer to do the onward gifting to family, subject to all the sort of normal IHT caveats and everything else. So
actually, that is a point that you might need. I mean, that might be also something you need to check with your pension provider as to your beneficiaries, whether you have a general class of beneficiaries or whether you need to stipulate that it's just your wife to get the spouse exemption.
Yeah, and your other point, because I like the numbers on this, and I'll bore people with a few numbers. One is that I think the change, if you'd been asking tax advisors or pensions advisors pre-budget, that we'd have been most concerned about would be the tax relief on pension contributions. And that, I think the cost each year is something like £70 billion. So I've been talking to a number of people, so I'm surprised that wasn't targeted, because you could chip away at that and raise 10 or 15 or 20 billion pounds relatively pain-free. I know that the pain is all, we're measuring it in financial terms and it's all relative, but it wouldn't have had an immediate impact particularly. The other point I was going to make, so surprised we didn't get that. The other point, looking through the projections that are issued by the Treasury when budgets are announced, everything we focus on, and we've talked about in previous podcasts, APR and BPR is projected by the end of the forecast period for this government to be raising about £500 million a year. This pension IHT change is going to raise nearly 3 times as much as that. So in terms of significance, it's got some real clout behind it. But I think we've all been lulled, partly because of the way the farmers have actioned things and been on the streets of Westminster in their tractors. Because of the timeline, we focus on some immediate changes, some changes from April 26, i.e. APR and BPR, and the pensions is coming up on the rails. But the 2 years, less than 2 years, will come around pretty quickly. So that's my bit on the numbers.
It's really interesting.
Just for interest, yeah.
It's interesting what grabs the taxpayers' attention. And obviously the farmers and the tractors have grabbed the attention. We've spoken before about the implications on the family business and sort of BPR and shares and the IHT charge arising on those now. But this one really hasn't seemed to catch anyone's attention, really.
No, and I said to you, and I should caveat this with, this is my own work with my own calculator, so I could be wrong. But in the consultation, there are a number of case studies, and the first two, case study 1 has Emily, and I'm not going to go through the numbers, but including her pension in her death estate from April 27 gives a 147% increase in her inheritance tax liability. That's a 147% increase. And example 2, Jazz, who dies age 65, has, again on my maths, a 267% increase in her IHT liability. So there's some fairly startling figures. I think somewhere, and I've got lots of bits of paper on my desk in front of me, Treasury emphasising that this is only going to affect a small number. 8% rings a bell of estates, but the impact as their own examples show is going to be fairly significant, very significant for those estates. So it is, as I said earlier on, without getting political, it is a change of political direction as to what the purpose of a pension pot is, which we could debate, but that's kind of going beyond the scope of what we do as the day job and getting into murky political waters, which we're not going to dip our toes into.
But I suppose that flows through to also the point about where you've got clients historically, when you look at their overall assets on death, the availability of the nil rate band, and then the main residence nil rate band, which takes them up to having sort of 500,000 each.
Yes.
That is tapered down after if their total assets are over 2 million. Whereas if people are now putting the pension pot in that calculation, there's more risk of that sort of additional 175,000 main residence nil rate band being reduced on the basis that that asset wasn't historically added into the calculation, whereas now as it is. So that's going to sort of wind that down. Then also looking at the nil rate band, where if people do have it available on death, that's not going to be a simple exercise trying to work out, because that will be then a portion between the pension, their other assets. And you were talking, but when we were sort of having our prep time before this podcast, do you want to sort of briefly touch on the implications on the pension provider and the executors?
Yes, you're right, because someone, and it's going to be the personal representatives, executors, are going to have to do the IHT reporting, but they're going to be doing it for themselves, for call it the normal estate, and for the pension scheme administrator in relation to the pension pot, because that's where the liability will sit. And that's the focus of a lot of the consultation, is how's that going to work? But I was sort of throwing out to you, well, will a pension scheme administrator just accept the number calculated by the personal representatives? And how will that relationship work? There'll have to be quite a lot of liaison between the two, between executors on the one hand and pension scheme administrators, to get it right. Pension scheme administrators, quite correctly carrying out their duties, I'm sure will want to have an overview of the whole IHT calculation to make sure that they're not overpaying. They're not just going to accept, I suspect, a number that they are given. So there's going to be quite a lot of extra admin, which clearly we don't currently have, that's going to need some sorting out. Now, whether that's going to be included in the rules, no, it can't be. But in practical terms, each pension scheme administrator is going to have to say, well, this is what we will want from executors, ERs, to enable us to say, yes, we're happy that the liability is right and our share of it is that much, before they write the check. So some interesting practical dynamics, but I think probably, as I was saying to you, the Treasury don't really worry about it. It's over to you. But it's going to throw some extra burden onto,
and extra cost for the pension providers as well, isn't it?
Right? Yeah.
And have you had many clients? I mean, obviously, if you look at when we're doing, which is something for us, is our bread and butter, is IHT planning. You look at total assets, look at what you can sort of relieve against the IHT, what reliefs are available. Have you had many clients saying, well, obviously, if I have a load of assets in my personal name, I can think about APR, BPR, which obviously doesn't reduce it to nil anymore, but it can mitigate it. Have you had many clients saying, well, what about my pension? Can I start trying to get BPR or APR within the pension pot? And how would that work?
Not yet, but yes, if you are in control, along with your pension administrators, investment advisors, and all of what the investments are, it must be somewhere something you could start to look at, mustn't it? But it's so new, and as I say, I think we've all been distracted by the other more pressing things, that these sort of slightly longer term things I don't think have come to the fore yet. And in fact, I was talking to someone yesterday who's asked if I can do some advice on family wealth and inheritance tax planning, and I said, well, to start with, can you let me have a schedule of assets? But I didn't even think to say, well, and by the way, don't forget that if we're looking at a 2-year, 3-year window, that needs to include pension pots. And I don't know whether that will be in this client's thinking or not. But suddenly we're going to have to change. And if that information doesn't come in, I'll have to say, don't forget pension, because we can't just do a plan that applies for the next 23 months or whatever it is. It needs to be longer term than that. So it's just different thoughts that you need to bring to the surface and chat through with clients, isn't it?
And I wonder whether is there an argument they could potentially argue that the pension is some form of trust, and therefore would we say, oh, for BPR, APR, do you get your 1 million allowance? I mean, I'm really kind of going off on a tangent here, but that's something that, that would be worth looking into anyway at some point. But yeah, there again, we just need the legislation now to see whether to see what can be done. But I mean, from a tax planning perspective, say you're in your late 40s, early 50s, thinking, well, gosh, that's going to be subject to IHT. Is it worth doing it still? I think there's still merit. I mean, when they increased the ISA allowances, that was, they're encouraging people to pay into their pension, but equally ISAs, you put post-tax, you put into the ISA and it grows tax-free. But, pensions, is it still going to be an interesting option for people? I think it still is and should be considered.
It should be, for sure. I suppose my worry is that all of this tweaking and the over the next couple of years, there's bound to be more publicity and more negative publicity. Does it just put people off? I mean, I'm of an age, as you know, where I say to our trainees who look at me blankly, you should be thinking about pensions, young man or young lady, and they're not, because they're in their 20s, or they are only because of the requirements that there are now to contribute, and the firm contributes and all those sorts of things. But it just worries me that it makes pensions slightly less attractive, and therefore people aren't providing for their futures when really they should be. And my constant complaint about these things would be that we're not encouraging people by saying, here's a long-term planning window, you can work out what the regime will look like in 5 years or 10 years, and therefore you're encouraged to do something today where you've got visibility about what's coming up, i.e. you invest now and there won't be any changes. Quite the opposite. So you can almost guarantee that the 20-something-year-old trainees that I'm talking to in the office now, how many pension changes will there be between them making contributions in 2025 and then retiring in cracky 20 whenever 60 70. So I think, and that's again at the danger of getting a bit onto my soapbox and getting too political about it, but you want to encourage people, I would have thought, to be making provision for their retirement, and I think all of these changes have run the risk of achieving the opposite of that.
Well, I think also, I mean, from a personal perspective, I would prefer to pay into a pension because then I can't touch it for a few years and it's locked away.
You're disciplined.
And I can't have an excuse to take it out and spend it. But then equally, we look at one of our sort of standard planning options for parents or grandparents, in fact, is to say, why don't you pay into a pension for your grandchildren so that grows over time? But then, I mean, I think, but from that perspective, from IHT, from grandparents to grandchildren, it's more about control, whereas they can put some money away and know that they won't be able to have it until they're in their late 50s. So that's a slightly different point, because they're not, I suppose they're potentially paying into it out of surplus income and reducing their estate. It's not looking at it as a pension pot. What do I do on death? But I think they're all things to factor in. And, I suppose with a lot of these things, it's having a smorgasbord or a mix of all of it to make sure you're not exposing yourself in any, because if someone now is looking at paying into a pension pot and think, well, it'll all be subject to IHT, subject to any reliefs, why don't I just pay into a AIM portfolio and I know I'll get 50% relief? Well, potentially if it still stands and, at the time of death,
over many years' time.
Is that worth considering instead? So I definitely think it's worth looping in with your financial advisor.
Definitely. Because we can't do this in isolation because we're just looking at the tax aspects, which are only part of it. You absolutely need, I'm sure you're going to do your little wrap up in a minute which will say that, but this is one in particular where we are not the pensions experts in the room, we are tax advisors.
Exactly. Well, I think that's a very good point to end on. So that's all from this episode of the Safaris Private Wealth podcast. At Safaris, we work with a wide range of clients, both in the UK and overseas. We advise individuals and families on how best to safeguard, maintain and enhance their wealth, and on the most appropriate methods of passing on that wealth to the next generation. We also help people comply with the tax laws in the UK, which can be complex. It's important for me to mention that if you're considering any of the topics discussed today, you must always take professional advice based on your own circumstances. If you'd like to find out more about the services we offer at Safri, please do visit our website at www.safri.com. And don't forget to subscribe to your preferred podcast platform and leave us a review if you found this episode helpful. Thank you for listening. See you next time.